A quiet investigation around Nancy Guthrie suddenly caught national attention after new evidence began surfacing in public records. Hidden documents, unexpected timelines, and unexplained connections slowly pointed toward two surprising names: Tommaso Cioni and Dominic Evans. At first, the mentions seemed minor, but investigators and journalists noticed the same pattern appearing again and again. What started as scattered references soon turned into a growing web of questions. Now many are asking one thing: how close were these two men to the center of the Nancy Guthrie case? For weeks, almost no one outside a small circle had even heard the name Nancy Guthrie connected to controversy. It was the kind of case that quietly existed in the background, mentioned briefly in local reports, discussed in short online threads, and then quickly buried beneath the endless cycle of bigger headlines. At first glance, it seemed like just another routine investigation. But something about it didn't sit right with the people closest to the story. Small inconsistencies began to surface. Tiny details that most viewers would normally ignore. A timeline that didn't perfectly align. A statement that sounded slightly different depending on who repeated it. None of these pieces alone looked important. Yet together they created a quiet tension. Journalists started asking questions. Online communities began comparing notes. And slowly, what had once been a quiet case started to attract a different kind of attention. The first turning point came when independent researchers began digging through public records and archived reports. What they found wasn't dramatic at first, just scattered fragments of information that seemed oddly connected. Names appeared in documents that weren't supposed to be connected. And among those names, two stood out: Tommaso Cioni, Dominic Evans. At first, their appearance seemed almost accidental. Just a passing reference buried inside layers of paperwork and reports. Nothing that clearly suggested wrongdoing. But experienced investigators know something important. Coincidences rarely stay coincidences for long. Soon, people started asking the same quiet question. Why were these names appearing around the Nancy Guthrie case? Neither Cioni nor Evans had been central figures in the public narrative up to that point. Their connection, if there was one, had never been clearly explained. Yet the more researchers looked, the more often those names resurfaced. Sometimes in communication logs, sometimes in background reports, sometimes in small details that most people would normally overlook. The story was no longer just about Nancy Guthrie. It was beginning to expand. And with expansion came speculation. Online forums filled with theories. Amateur investigators began constructing timelines. Some of the claims were exaggerated. Others turned out to be misleading. But buried within the noise were a few discoveries that professional reporters couldn't ignore. Pieces of evidence, small but persistent, suggested that the connections might not be random after all. Suddenly, the quiet case was no longer quiet. News outlets that had once ignored the situation began paying attention. Investigative journalists started reviewing the same records that internet sleuths had been discussing for days. And the deeper they looked, the more complicated the picture became. Because if the emerging evidence was correct, then the Nancy Guthrie case might involve far more people than anyone originally believed, including two men whose names had just begun circulating far beyond the circles where the story first started: Tommaso Cioni, Dominic Evans. And as more information slowly surfaced, a new question began to echo through newsrooms and online discussions alike. Were these names simply appearing by coincidence? Or were they part of something much bigger that had remained hidden until now? The answer wasn't clear yet, but the quiet case that once lived in the shadows had officially stepped into the spotlight. And the deeper investigators looked, the stranger the story began to feel. When the names Tommaso Cioni and Dominic Evans first surfaced in connection with the Nancy Guthrie case, the reaction was almost disbelief. Not outrage, not panic, just confusion. Because up until that moment, neither name had been part of the public conversation surrounding the investigation. The story had followed a completely different direction, with attention focused elsewhere. Analysts, journalists, and online investigators had been building their timelines around a very different set of characters. So when Cioni and Evans suddenly appeared in documents and discussion threads, many people assumed it had to be a mistake. But the mentions didn't disappear. Instead, they started multiplying. One report referenced a communication that included Cioni's name. Another archive hinted at a meeting where Evans had reportedly been present. On their own, these references didn't prove anything. In fact, they were vague enough that many observers initially brushed them aside. Yet the pattern kept repeating, and patterns are difficult to ignore. Independent journalists began tracing the timeline more carefully. They compared statements that had been made early in the investigation with documents that were only now coming into public view. They looked at travel records, communications, and small administrative details that normally stay buried in the background of a case. The more they examined the timeline, the more something began to feel unusual. Certain moments in the investigation suddenly looked different when those two names were placed into the picture. A phone call here, a meeting there, a small gap in a timeline that previously had no explanation. None of it was explosive evidence. At least not yet. But it was enough to spark curiosity among reporters who had spent years covering complicated investigations. Meanwhile, online communities were moving even faster. Discussion forums exploded with theories. Amateur investigators began mapping out connections using screenshots, archived pages, and public records. Some theories stretched far beyond what the facts supported, while others remained cautious and focused only on verifiable details. Still, one thing was becoming impossible to deny. Tommaso Cioni and Dominic Evans were now part of the conversation. And with their names circulating across news platforms and social media, the pressure on investigators began to grow. Reporters started asking direct questions. Had these individuals been interviewed? Were they witnesses, associates, or something else entirely? Why had their names not appeared earlier? For officials connected to the case, the situation became increasingly delicate. Investigations often rely on controlled information, and sudden public speculation can complicate the process dramatically. Yet silence can sometimes create even more questions. Every day that passed without clear answers allowed the curiosity to grow stronger. And curiosity in a case like this can spread quickly. Behind the scenes, journalists continued digging. Some began contacting sources who had quietly followed the case from the beginning. Others searched through older reports that had never attracted much attention at the time. What they discovered next would add a new layer of intrigue to the story. Because the deeper they looked into the timeline surrounding Nancy Guthrie, the more moments appeared where Cioni and Evans seemed to orbit the same events. Not always directly, but often close enough to raise eyebrows. And that raised a question that was now becoming impossible to avoid. Were these connections simply the result of overlapping social or professional circles? Or were investigators slowly uncovering a network of relationships that had never been fully examined before? No one could answer that yet. But one thing was becoming very clear. The story was no longer just about Nancy Guthrie. It was now about the growing trail of names, documents, and unanswered questions that seemed to lead in several unexpected directions. And somewhere along that trail, a new discovery was waiting, one that would push the investigation into an entirely different phase. At first, the pieces looked ordinary. A message log here, a record of a meeting there, a few scattered references buried inside documents that had been sitting quietly in archives for months. Individually, none of it seemed powerful enough to change the direction of an investigation. But the moment investigators began placing those pieces side by side, something unusual started to emerge. The timeline began to tighten. Journalists who had been following the case closely noticed that certain events surrounding Nancy Guthrie appeared closer together than originally reported. Conversations that once seemed unrelated suddenly looked connected. Moments that had once passed unnoticed now felt strangely important. And once again, two names kept appearing around those moments. Tommaso Cioni, Dominic Evans. The pattern was subtle, but it was there. In some cases, it was a record showing that someone had been present during key discussions. In other cases, it was a mention inside communications that had previously gone unnoticed. Sometimes it was nothing more than a reference that appeared at the edge of a report, easy to miss unless someone was carefully reading every line. But investigators were now doing exactly that, carefully reading everything. One journalist described the process as assembling a puzzle where half the pieces were still hidden under the table. Every time a new piece appeared, the overall image shifted slightly. And slowly, that image was becoming harder to ignore. The most surprising part wasn't just that these connections existed. It was how long they had remained unnoticed. In many investigations, early reports focus on the most obvious elements of the story. That's where the media attention usually goes first. But complex cases often hide their most important details deeper inside administrative records and background communications. That's exactly where the new discoveries were being found. Reporters began comparing early statements from officials with the newer information now circulating online. In some cases, the differences were small, tiny shifts in wording or timing. But those small differences added new layers to the story. Meanwhile, the public conversation surrounding the case was growing louder. Online discussions were no longer limited to small communities of amateur investigators. Larger media platforms were now asking similar questions, carefully reviewing the same trail of documents that had first sparked curiosity. And with every new article, the pressure surrounding the investigation increased. People wanted clarity. They wanted to understand how these names fit into the bigger picture. Were Tommaso Cioni and Dominic Evans simply witnesses connected to events that happened around Nancy Guthrie? Or were they part of a deeper chain of events that investigators were only now beginning to understand? At that stage, no one was making direct accusations. Responsible journalists were careful with their wording, focusing only on the documented connections that had already surfaced. But the sense of momentum was impossible to ignore, because every few days another detail seemed to appear, another archived message, another document, another moment in the timeline that quietly strengthened the growing web of connections. It was as if the evidence had been sitting there all along waiting for someone to look closely enough to notice it. And now that people were looking, the trail was becoming impossible to hide, which meant the investigation was approaching a critical point. Because once a story reaches this level of public attention, investigators can no longer move quietly in the background. Sooner or later, answers have to emerge. And the spotlight that had now turned toward Tommaso Cioni and Dominic Evans was only growing brighter. By this point, the story had begun to take on a life of its own. What started as quiet curiosity was now turning into sustained public pressure. Reporters were asking sharper questions. Analysts were examining the timeline more closely than ever before. And the names Tommaso Cioni and Dominic Evans were no longer appearing only in small investigative circles. They were now part of a much larger public conversation. For investigators, this kind of attention can be both helpful and dangerous. Helpful because public scrutiny sometimes pushes hidden details into the open. Dangerous because speculation can easily move faster than verified facts. And speculation was everywhere. Social media threads stretched for hundreds of comments. Amateur researchers posted timelines, screenshots, and theories that tried to connect every new discovery with the last. Some of those claims were clearly exaggerated. Others, however, were rooted in real documents that journalists themselves were now reviewing. The pressure was building. Newsrooms began reaching out to people connected to the investigation, hoping someone would finally clarify the growing list of questions. Some sources declined to comment. Others offered careful, measured responses that revealed very little. But the silence itself began to feel significant. In situations like this, even the absence of information can become part of the story. Behind the scenes, reporters continued speaking with individuals who had quietly followed the case from the beginning. A few of those sources suggested that investigators had already been aware of certain connections long before the public discovered them. If that was true, it meant something important. It meant the emerging trail of evidence might not be surprising to the people officially handling the case. Instead, it could simply be the result of information slowly reaching the public. That possibility raised an even bigger question. How much more did investigators already know? Meanwhile, attention surrounding Tommaso Cioni and Dominic Evans continued to grow. Every public appearance, every past interview, every digital footprint suddenly attracted renewed scrutiny. Journalists began reviewing older statements and public records, trying to understand whether there had been earlier signs that might now look different in hindsight. In some cases, they found nothing unusual. In others, they discovered small details that seemed worth a second look. And that's often how major revelations begin, not with a single dramatic moment, but with a gradual accumulation of questions that refuse to go away. For Cioni and Evans, the situation was becoming increasingly complicated. Even without formal accusations, being connected to an expanding investigation can place enormous pressure on anyone involved. Reputation, public perception, professional relationships, all of it can shift quickly once a story reaches this level of visibility. At the same time, investigators were reportedly continuing their work away from the cameras. Cases like this rarely move in straight lines. Leads appear, disappear, and sometimes lead to entirely different conclusions than the public expects, which meant the growing pressure surrounding the two men might not represent the end of the story. Could simply be the beginning of a new phase, a phase where investigators would finally need to address the questions that had been circulating for weeks. Because by now, one thing was impossible to ignore. The Nancy Guthrie case had grown far beyond its original scope. And the public wanted answers. Not rumors, not speculation, real answers. But the final question, the one that everyone was quietly waiting to hear addressed, was still hanging in the air. What exactly happened to Nancy Guthrie? And how close were Tommaso Cioni and Dominic Evans to the center of it all? By now, the story had reached a point where silence felt louder than any statement. Weeks earlier, the Nancy Guthrie case had been little more than a quiet investigation. A situation unfolding slowly, with only occasional updates and limited public interest. Now it was something very different. News outlets were watching closely. Online communities were dissecting every new detail. And the names Tommaso Cioni and Dominic Evans had become permanently tied to the expanding narrative surrounding the case. But despite all the attention, the most important question still had no clear answer. What actually happened? Investigators rarely reveal everything while a case is still unfolding. Evidence must be verified. Witnesses must be protected. And premature conclusions can damage the search for truth. Yet the growing trail of connections had created an atmosphere where people felt that something significant was waiting just beyond the visible facts. Every new discovery seemed to point toward a larger picture that was still incomplete. Journalists continued to review documents, searching for clues that might explain how all the pieces fit together. They examined communications, timelines, and reports that had only recently come to light. And again, they returned to the same central mystery. Nancy Guthrie. Her name remained at the heart of everything. Who she spoke to in the days before the controversy began. Where key meetings took place. Why certain events unfolded in the sequence they did. Each of those questions seemed to carry threads that led outward into a network of relationships and interactions. Some of those threads were easy to follow. Others disappeared into gaps where information had not yet surfaced. And somewhere within that network, investigators were believed to be focusing their attention. Publicly, officials remained cautious. No dramatic announcements. No sudden accusations. Just the slow, deliberate process that serious investigations require. Still, the environment surrounding the case had clearly changed. The spotlight was now too bright for the story to quietly fade away. Every development, no matter how small, was being noticed. For Tommaso Cioni and Dominic Evans, that spotlight meant their connection to the story would likely continue to be examined. Whether those connections would eventually prove significant or simply coincidental remained uncertain. But the attention itself showed how far the case had evolved. Stories like this often follow an unpredictable path. Early assumptions can collapse. Unexpected information can shift the entire direction of an investigation overnight. That possibility was now hanging over the Nancy Guthrie case. Because while many questions had been raised, the final answers had not yet emerged. And when they do, when investigators eventually reveal the full timeline and the complete set of facts, the public may discover that the story is far more complex than anyone imagined during these early stages. For now, the case remains open in the court of public attention. Documents continue to surface. Investigators continue their work. And observers across the world continue asking the same question. Not just about Tommaso Cioni. Not just about Dominic Evans. but about the deeper truth behind the events that brought all of these names together in the first place. A truth that, sooner or later, will finally come into the light.